Welcome back to Cool Comics. Today I'm going to be talking about Superman Earth 1. This is a 3-volume graphic novel series that is a part of an alternate universe called Earth 1 that DC tried to establish back in 2010, or around 2010 rather. It started with Superman, then we got Batman, and then Wonder Woman. I've read Batman, at least the first volume, and I haven't touched Wonder Woman. I haven't read that yet, but I'm very interested to see how those other two series finish out, so I'll definitely be reading them. But as far as Superman is concerned, this is a pretty interesting take on Superman. There's a couple things I don't like and a couple things that I do like. One thing that I like is that the character designs and a lot of their characterizations seem on point with what's been established. Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane are Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane. They're not some sort of weird or woke take on those characters. They're just pretty much traditionally as they have been. Their attitudes, their dialogue, that's all on point. Definitely think that that's a positive of this series. Negative of this series, Clark Kent himself, he's more of that. This was during that time from 2010 to 2015 where they were trying to make Superman a lot darker because that was what was working for Batman, and that was, I think, what was drawing some people. People didn't want to see Superman as being too goofy or too altruistic, and they wanted to give him a little bit of edge, and I don't think that really ended up working, to be honest with you, and I never really liked that. I thought that was always kind of odd. Man of Steel was not a good movie in my opinion. Although there are people who do like it, I walked away from that film pretty disappointed, to be honest with you. I think the first half of it was decent, and then once you get to the Superman parts, it's just, that's not Superman at all. And you might feel the same way about the first volume of Earth 1, because this first volume of Earth 1 parallels Man of Steel quite a bit, to the point where you wonder if they were paying close attention to the production of Man of Steel, because it came out before Man of Steel, but it feels as though one influenced the other, even though they're probably pretty far apart in terms of, I don't think that Zack Snyder was looking over his shoulder at J. Michael Straczynski and what he was writing for Superman Earth 1. I think it was just purely coincidental. I think that was maybe a mandate they had at DC where this is what we're going to do with Superman now. So, either way, I think Volume 1 is the weakest volume, even though it has one of the coolest covers. It's mostly an establishing story, and it drags its feet doing so. It really drags its feet doing so, to the point where you finally get introduced to the villain of the story and the overall action. It feels like it took forever to get there, and from that point onward, from the next two volumes, I think it gets a lot better, especially by Volume 3. I think Volume 3 is the best volume in this series, and I like the way it ends, and I'm actually disappointed they didn't cap off with a Volume 4, because they introduce a villain at the end of Volume 3, and it's a very fascinating villain to me, and I'd like to see what they do with that particular villain going forward, but we may never know now, because it seems like the series is just done, because it didn't perform the way they had hoped, which is surprising, because the first volume was a New York Times bestseller. It was attracting people because they were doing a different take on Superman. This thing was being marketed as Superman for a new generation. Every generation has a Superman. This is the 2010s generation Superman, and it definitely is that, for better or worse. It's definitely a 2010 Superman, and there's a lot of 2010s style, attitude, and references. They reference Twitter and smartphones, and when all of that was starting to rise up, so it's somewhat applicable to even today, but as time goes on, it's just going to feel more and more dated in that sense, and I think that that's the problem with trying to modernize a lot of these DC heroes, is that you fall into the trap of stagnating them because, hey, look, it's the Superman or Batman or Green Lantern or Wonder Woman of this generation, and that's where it's going to stay. Whereas the original characters are timeless. You can update some of their story beats, maybe their settings, the technology around them, but you really can't update them. There are certain character traits and ways they do things and ways they're written that need to stay the same. And while this book does do a good job of trying to stay faithful to as much as possible, in some ways it veers too far in the we want to modernize direction. And a lot of that has to do with Clark Kent himself and his responses to things and the way he talks and that sort of thing. It just comes across as just awkward in terms of trying to be relatable, because Superman is not really a relatable character outside of his his morality, his drive, his desire to see humanity saved and to save humanity effectively from itself and from outside forces, and his quest for truth, justice, and the American way. You know, that whole thing. And by the way, yes, that's still his motto. I don't care what DC says or what they try to pull. That is Superman. You can't take that away from him. And heaven knows they've tried multiple times. So these are overall decent Superman stories. Good for beginners. I was sort of a comic book beginner when I read these, and I think that's why I was excited, because I was getting to be in on a new comic book thing that was happening. And this was an attempt to draw new readers. I believe it honestly was. And it may have succeeded in that, although, unfortunately, you had New 52 around the same time, which was a very mixed bag. A lot of people hated it. Legacy readers absolutely hated the New 52. And then after that, it just got worse, until where we are today, where it's just none of it's even worth touching with a 10-foot pole from DC or Marvel. The comics industry is just absolute garbage, but I think this series is one of DC's last really decent series overall. I wouldn't call it terrible. I wouldn't call it bad. I wouldn't call it great. I wouldn't call it fantastic. I would just call it good. As an overall, I would call it good. And maybe you disagree, and I think that you're absolutely entitled to do so, because I can see these books having mixed reception. Absolutely. I can see the positives. I can see the negatives. Just as a spoiler alert, I'm going to go through some specific spoiler details to kind of demonstrate my point of what could be received positive and what could be received negative. So if you don't want spoilers, then I would recommend clicking off the video. My overall rating for this series is a 6 out of 10, or no, it's a 7 out of 10. It's absolutely a 7 out of 10. Like I said, it's good. It's not great. It's not fantastic. It's just good. Does a lot right, does a lot wrong. So what they do right, again, Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane are Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane, and I love whenever they show up. Clark Kent isn't really Clark Kent, and he isn't really Superman. He's more moody, more brooding, more, what on earth do I do? And that's something that they did in Man of Steel, and I was just so tired of that. I really was. So that's a negative. A positive, they give him a love interest other than Lois Lane and Lana Lang. Her name is Lisa, I forget her last name. Lisa something or other, and she's his neighbor in his apartment complex. I really like the dynamic that they established there. I think it's a pretty good one. And they actually develop her character in a short period of time, which I think is really cool. That's a positive. Another negative is the villains are very disposable. He doesn't kill them, as far as I'm aware. One does die. I believe we're introduced to Zod in the final volume, and I believe he does die, but not by Superman's hand. I think at that point he said, I'm not killing, because he does kill in, I believe, Volume 2. We see one instance of him killing as he's trying to figure it out, and he has to go with that sort of regret. It's not like Man of Steel, where he was just screaming after he killed Zod, you know? It was more like, he's like, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, and there were consequences for that. So he learns very quickly that that's not something he's supposed to do, although I wish he wouldn't do it in general. You know, if you want to establish that, you know, maybe he does it for the first time and makes a mistake, I think that's fine. But in general, I don't think that he should kill. Same with Batman. That's just who these characters have been. That's who they are. That's who their audience knows them to be. So I'm not a big fan of having Superman kill, although in this story, it's done once and it makes sense, and he never does it again. But the most interesting part about this story, to me, and it might not interest some other people, was how they handled the character of Lex Luthor, because while they introduced Zod, they also introduced Lex Luthor. But they introduced Lex Luthor as a couple of Lex Luthor and Alexandria Luthor. And Lex Luthor, the husband, was more calculated and moral than the wife. And what ends up happening is, when Superman is fighting Zod, Zod ends up getting defeated, but in the process, Lex, the husband, ends up dying. And the wife, Alexandria, freaks out and blames Superman for everything, and she ends up becoming the Lex Luthor that we know. Now, some people might be against this. They're like, oh, great, just another gender swap, right? If you're going to gender swap villains, this is how you do it. Because you're not really doing that. What you're doing is you're introducing and creating a villain organically. This is an organically created villain. Yes, the scenario of a loved one dying and the person going insane and vowing vengeance on the hero who didn't do anything. We saw that all in Spider-Man 3. I mean, we pretty much saw that throughout the Spider-Man series where Spider-Man killed my dad. You know, he walked in as he was bringing the Goblin in. It's basically that, but with the character of Alexandria Luthor and Lex Luthor, and she vows vengeance on Superman, blah, blah, blah. We've seen it a million times before, but I like that way more than just reintroducing Lex Luthor as a girl. I think that's way better. And unfortunately, because we don't get a Volume 4, we don't get to see her in action. We don't get to see her plotting against Superman. It's just implied. I think they thought they were going to do another volume, so they left it open-ended, but we really don't get to see her in action, and I really wanted to, you know, and I don't trust that we'll ever get, if we ever do get another female Lex Luthor, it'll be just awful. There might already be one, but I don't care at this point. Unless it's the Earth 1 version, and they're continuing where they left off, I really don't care. So, that was both a positive and a negative. I like the new Lex Luthor. I don't like the fact that they didn't really get to show her in action other than she tried to shoot Superman with a revolver, and that went about as well as you'd expect. So, another negative is I'm just not a fan of the overall art direction. I like the character designs, but the art direction of the settings and how dark it is, it's very dark and muted colors. I don't like that. And I think the colorist did fine, but she was directed or chose, whichever way, to go with these darker colors and more shadows, and sometimes it was hard to tell what I was looking at in some panels. In some instances, it was very hard to tell what I was looking at, and I'm not a big fan of that in any book. So, like I said, this series, a lot of positives, a lot of negatives, but as an overall, I think it's worth a read. I don't think it's the most fantastic Superman series I've ever read. There's easily better, but for what they attempted to do, I think it was a pretty decent attempt. But I think ultimately it didn't really stick the landing. It's open-ended. I'd love for them to do at least one more volume and then give it a definitive ending. But I don't see DC doing that, and I don't trust modern DC to do it right anyways, so it is what it is. So thank you very much for watching. This has been Super Koopa TV with another edition of Cool Comics. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.